Good morning. My name is Laurie Ridgeway. I'm from Canada. I'm the Director General of International Policy and Integration in our Ministry of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. As Director General of a rather large policy group, it's really in a policy function. I'm responsible for international trade, international business development, international fisheries policy, and international oceans and biodiversity. And in that respect, it's a very nice position to be in because it gives you an idea about the whole agenda that we're involved in here and how it links together. And of course, it's especially important because a conference like this is about the whole agenda and how things like fishing fit into oceans, and that's my job, is to make sure that the Canadian government is coherent with respect to how we view those issues. So I'm in a very lucky position in that respect. I guess the most important thing that this conference is doing is talking about that whole picture and how oceans are important to everybody in the world because they contribute to the way that the whole globe functions, and also because the oceans provide things to people, either food or livings or culture altogether. And the worrying about the biodiversity of the oceans is really important to all of that. So where does fishing fit in? Fishing is one of the largest activities in the ocean that takes things out of the oceans. And so fishing has to be part of the solution to healthy oceans. And right now, in many respects, fishing is viewed as one of the problems of the oceans and not one part of the solution. So we have to change things in order to make sure that fishing is seen differently and is different in respect of how it plays in the ocean. So what we ultimately need is that fishing that is responsible is seen as a legitimate and important part of the oceans and for the communities and people that rely on them, and that we find ways of making sure that irresponsible fishing is choked off. And we try to do that in a way that's fair to all countries. And we're not discriminating, but we really must make sure that fisheries changes its reputation as part of the solution and not part of the problem. And so that's what we're here to discuss on the fishing side, is how to make that transformation. And it's a global issue. Globalization has meant that every single country in the world is implicated in this because it's either a consuming state or it's a fishing state or it's a port, and so it's everybody's problem. And when we are dealing with fishing in the high seas in particular, you can't solve this problem unless you're doing it through international cooperation. And a lot of it is not necessarily embedded in law. It's really about cooperation and how are we going to build a system that enables fishing to be responsible. So who does that involve, and what are we talking about there? We're talking about how individual fishing operators are going to be responsible operators. That means how do they fish, where do they fish, are they following the rules, and are the rules internationally clear so that they have rules to follow. So we have part of an obligation on fishing itself, which we have to talk about here in terms of making sure that the cooperation mechanisms are there and that the regulatory frameworks are there and that, like any other business in the world, those who are operating in it know the rules and they know that they'll be enforced and they know that there'll be penalties if they're not. That's how any business operates in the world. And fishing is one where that's been a bit weaker than many. And fishing is undermined by those who don't follow the rules. And part of the problem is making sure that those rules start to encompass more than just making sure that fish are fished sustainably, but also that fishing is becoming part of the environmental agenda. And so we're trying to modernize those rules to make sure that fishing itself is part of the solution of environmental protection. The second part of the issue, though, is broader because we have to involve places where fish is landed. That is, ports have to be part of the solution. We can't have fishers that can break the rules, find ways of landing their fish illegally. So we have to also talk here about how ports will be made to raise their standards and make sure that they block off the landings of illegal or badly managed fisheries from irresponsible vessels. It's also critically important that states that flag vessels understand that they have obligations in order to make sure that the vessels that fly their flags are following rules. That's an extremely important but very new area in fishing. It's much more mature in the shipping side. A new part of it is also about markets and consumers. And that is, if we manage to get fishing vessels to comply with rules, it will never be 100%. If ports where fish are landed follow rules and inspect vessels and block landings from irresponsible vessels, it will all be undermined if there are markets where illegal or unsustainable product can find an outlet. And that really comes down to whether consumers are going to start to be educated about what they eat, or whether they're just going to be buying the cheapest product, many times of which is illegal product. And so we are here to talk about some of those problems and how we can find ideas to to push forward the agenda in some of those very important areas. And the most critically important areas are three, I think. One is to make sure that we aren't making decisions that are contrary to the sustainability of fisheries, and that is that we're overfishing, even if we've made it legal, because we ignore science. That's one really important aspect. A second important aspect is illegal fishing. How are we going to use all of that fishing system and the regulations we put in place and all the pressures of consumers and markets and ports and flags in order to make sure that we are not aiding illegal fishing? And thirdly, the critical glue of fishing to the broader agenda of this conference, which is how are we going to ensure that fishing is also environmentally linked, environmentally sustainable? How do we make sure that vessels are not fishing on very sensitive coral areas, for instance, or other very, very sensitive environmental areas where, just like on land, in cities, we have a combination of areas where we have economic activity, but we have areas like national parks where we don't. We have to start thinking about the oceans in the same kind of way, where we can fish in some areas but not others. And so it's more like zoning of the oceans in the way that we zone on land. It's a very new concept, but it's critical. And fishing could be part of the solution. It can be responsible, and it has to be seen as responsible, and that's what we're here to do. Why should everybody care about this? Well, we all care about oceans because they provide the cycles of living for us. The carbon cycles, the air cycles, the even health cycles that we have are dependent on oceans. And biodiversity in the oceans is what helps that happen. And fishing affects biodiversity, so it's everybody's problem that fishing is not seen as something that destroys biodiversity. Partly because, another reason why everybody should care is because fishing is part of the food cycle. And we worry about feeding the world's population, but it's critically important to some of our communities and to our fishers who have a legitimate right to earn a living from the asset, the biggest asset they live beside. And so we have to make sure that fishing, those communities are allowed to be attached to the resources that they have as a source of living. And lastly, because everybody's part of the solution. If consumers and individuals are going to consume and turn a blind eye to irresponsible product, it's going to it gives an escape to those who are irresponsible. And lastly, I would say everybody in the world has an obligation to be informed about these issues, because there's a lot of misinformation which leads to bad political decisions, and we need the world community to be informed and to be discerning listeners to a lot of the discussion about these issues so that they can put the appropriate pressure on their governments. So in a nutshell, that's what we're here. It's a very big agenda. It involves everybody. It's a very important agenda. A lot of it's new, and a lot of it is very, very difficult, because international law doesn't always make it very easy to cooperate internationally on these issues.